A final challenge. Let's read together Joshua 22. I may annotate as we go along. At that time, Joshua summoned the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh, and said to them, "You have kept all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, and have obeyed my voice in all that I have commanded you. You have not forsaken your brothers these many days, down to this day, but have been careful to keep the charge of the Lord your God. And now the Lord your God has given rest to your brothers, as he promised them. Therefore, turn and go to your tents in the land where your possession lies, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you on the other side of the Jordan. Only be very careful to observe the commandment and the law that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, to love the Lord your God, and to walk in all his ways, and to keep his commandments, and to cling to him, and to serve him with all of your heart and with all of your soul." So Joshua blessed them and sent them away, and they went to their tents. Now to the one half of the tribe of Manasseh, Moses had given a possession in Bashan, but to the other half, Joshua had given a possession beside their brothers in the land west of the Jordan. And when Joshua sent them away to their homes and blessed them, he said to them, "Go back to your tents with much wealth and with very much livestock and with silver, gold, bronze, and iron, and with much clothing. Divide the spoil of your enemies with your brothers." So the people of Reuben and the people of Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh returned home, parting from the people of Israel at Shiloh, which is in the land of Canaan, to go to the land of Gilead, their own land, of which they had possessed themselves by command of the Lord through Moses. And when they had come to the region of the Jordan, that is, in the land of Canaan, the people of Reuben and the people of Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh built there an altar by the Jordan, an altar of imposing size. And the people of Israel heard it, said, "Behold, the people of Reuben and the people of Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh have built the altar at the frontier of the land of Canaan, in the region about the Jordan, on the side that belongs to the people of Israel." And when the people of Israel heard of it, the whole assembly of the people of Israel gathered at Shiloh to make war against them. Then the people of Israel sent to the people of Reuben and the people of Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh in the land of Gilead, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar the priest, and with him 10 chiefs, one from each of the tribal families of Israel, every one of them the head of a family among the clans of Israel. And they came to the people of Reuben, the people of Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh in the land of Gilead, and they said to them, "Thus says the whole congregation of the Lord, what is this breach of faith that you have committed against the God of Israel in turning away this day from following the Lord by building yourselves an altar this day in rebellion against the Lord? Have we not had enough of the sin at Peor, from which even yet we have not cleansed ourselves, and for which there came a plague upon the congregation of the Lord, that you too must turn away this day from following the Lord? And if you too rebel against the Lord today, then tomorrow he will be angry with the whole congregation of Israel. But now, if the land of your possession is unclean, pass over into the Lord's land where the Lord's tabernacle stands, and take for yourselves a possession among us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, or make us as rebels by building for yourselves an altar other than the altar of the Lord our God. Did not Achan the son of Zerah break faith in the matter of the devoted things, and wrath fell upon all the congregations of Israel? And he did not perish alone for his iniquity. Then the people of Reuben, the people of Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh said in answer to the heads of the families of Israel, The mighty one, God the Lord. The mighty one, God the Lord. He knows, and let Israel itself know. If it was in rebellion or in breach of faith against the Lord, do not spare us today for building an altar to turn away from following the Lord. Or if we did so to offer burnt offerings or grain offerings or peace offerings on it, may the Lord himself take vengeance. No, but we did it from fear that in time to come your children might say to our children, what have you to do with the Lord, the God of Israel? For the Lord has made the Jordan a boundary between us and you people of Reuben and people of Gad. You have no portion in the land. And so your children might make our children cease to worship the Lord. Therefore we said, let us now build an altar, not for burnt offering, nor for sacrifice, but to be a witness between us and you, and between our generations after us, that we do perform the service of the Lord in his presence with our burnt offerings and sacrifices and peace offerings. So your children will not say to our children in time to come, you have no portion in the Lord. And we thought, if this should be said to us or to our descendants in time to come, we should say, behold, the copy of the altar of the Lord, which our fathers made, not for burnt offerings, nor for sacrifice, but to be a witness between us and you. Far be it from us, that we should rebel against the Lord and turn away this day from following the Lord by building an altar for burnt offerings, grain offering, or sacrifice, other than the altar of the Lord our God that stands before his tabernacle. When Phinehas, the priest, and the chiefs of the congregation, the heads of the families of Israel who were with him, heard the words that the people of Reuben and the people of Gad and the people of Manasseh spoke, it was good in their eyes. And Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the priest, said to the people of Reuben and the people of Gad and the people of Manasseh, today we know that the Lord is in our midst, because you have not committed this breach of faith against the Lord. Now you have delivered the people of Israel from the hand of the Lord. Then Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the priest, and the chiefs returned from the people of Reuben and the people of Gad in the land of Gilead to the land of Canaan to the people of Israel, and brought back word to them. And the report was good in the eyes of the people of Israel. And the people of Israel blessed God and spoke no more of making war against them to destroy the land where the people of Reuben and the people of Gad were settled. The people of Reuben and the people of Gad called the altar witness, for they said, it is a witness between us that the Lord is God. So you'll recall from last week that chapters 13 to 21 essentially cover the period of the allocation and possession of each tribe, their respective land for inheritance. And so they've entered the land, they've taken the land, and they have divided the land. And now the 2.5 tribes that had already chosen and been given the land east of the Jordan, in other words, on the outside of the official promised land markation, which was all to the west of the Jordan, they had come over, though, and joined the rest of Israel in conquering the land. And now that the land is conquered and divided, these 2.5 tribes, or the men from these 2.5 tribes, are now ready to return, to go back home to their land on the other side, on the east of the Jordan, to their families, and enjoy their inheritance which Moses had already given them. And so these 2.5 tribes have been obedient to the Lord. See, they've been faithful in their commitment to God, in that in receiving their land prior to the rest of the tribes, they had nonetheless committed to when the rest of the tribes would go into the promised land to take their land, they would join them and fight for them and with them to gain the rest of the promised land. And that's what they had done. That's how this account in chapter 22 begins. And so therefore, chapter 22 concludes an important part of the story in Joshua. An important part of the obedience to God, an important theme of that is demonstrated within the actions and faithfulness of these 2.5 tribes, as well as an important theme of the unity of the people of God, demonstrated in the obedience and the actions of these 2.5 tribes. You see, in chapter 1, as the book of Joshua began, it was mentioned even in an opening chapter, somewhat out of sync to what the rest of the chapter was saying, that these 2.5 tribes needed to remain faithful and join Israel now that they were ready to cross the Jordan and take on the promised land. It was mentioned then as something of importance. And now we've come full circle at chapter 22 to say they were faithful to the end and are now ready to return home. In fact, even when in chapter 4 in Joshua, it is recorded that Israel crossed in a miraculous way the Jordan River, it is specifically mentioned that men from these 2.5 tribes were with the rest of Israel crossing the river. And so clearly the experience and the role of these 2.5 tribes is significant in the book of Joshua and in the teaching of this book. Not least of all, in that here there is this entire chapter toward the end, a very long chapter that we've just read, devoted to the actions of these 2.5 tribes. And so there is something significant here that we need to learn. And so these 2 points to the sermon for today that the writer, and I trust God, is wanting us to take note of from these 2.5 tribes and their interaction with the rest of the people of Israel is this. This chapter for us, as the book of Joshua winds down and comes to an end, highlight these 2 things. The importance of the purity of our worship and the importance of the unity of our fellowship. So, firstly, what is evident is the purity of worship that needs to persist among us as God's people then and today. I've already mentioned, firstly, the example of obedience that these 2.5 tribes were. In fact, the account makes clear here when Joshua says to them in chapter 22, verse 2, how they have kept all, these 2.5 tribes kept all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded them, and have obeyed not only what Moses said, but what Joshua himself had also said, by not forsaking their brothers, etc., etc. And so they have been faithful to the Lord in their obedience toward Him, which has been, of course, an important theme throughout the book of Joshua, is the people's obedience to the Lord, that their possession and succession in the land was dependent upon their obedience to the Lord. That although God had promised them the land, they would only realize that promise as they walked and followed the Lord step by step in obedience. I mean, case in point was when you recall the incident at Ai, which is referred to here, when Achan kept back some of the devoted things, how they were defeated by the city of Ai, and how all of Israel suffered. And so right through the book of Joshua, from beginning to end, this theme of obedience to the Lord is emphasized. Joshua chapter 1, verse 8, "The book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do all that is written in it. And then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success." And the same thing that again Joshua reiterates to these already faithful people here as he sends them back to their land, and says in verse 5, "Only be very careful to observe the commandment and the law that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, to love the Lord your God, and to walk in all His ways, and to keep all His commandments, and to cling to Him, and to serve Him with all your heart and with all your soul." And so we must never forget that God demands our obedience, that God deserves our obedience, in fact, that God delights in our obedience. that obedience to God is an essential part of our lives as Christians. 1 John chapter 2 verse 3, and by this we know that we have come to know Him, if we keep His commands. 1 John 5 verse 3, for this is the love of God, that we keep His commandments, and His commandments are not burdensome. And so as we see the faithfulness and obedience of these 2.5 tribes, as we see the Lord through Joshua calling them and us and reiterating the importance of obedience in our lives as we live in this world, as they lived and will continue to live in the land for God, we've got to ask ourselves, are there areas in our own lives where we are not being faithful to God? Are there ways in which we perhaps are even begrudging obedience to God? Are there situations in our lives right now where we might be compromising our allegiance to God? That perhaps if we're honest, maybe we need to pray earnestly with the psalmist when he said, give me an undivided heart, O Lord, that I might fear your name. In fact, we see how the rest of Israel here understood the importance of obedience. Where they had learnt by now that obeying God is fundamental and non-negotiable. Where we see here their expression in their concern about what these 2.5 tribes had done in building this altar, their concern that gets raised for the jealousy of God and His glory. Where they are concerned, we see about the proper worship of God. These 2.5 tribes on their way out of the land, as we read, built an altar on the edge of the Jordan, a very large altar, a giant altar, so that it could be seen from that side of the Jordan and from this side of the Jordan. But when these tribes when the rest of Israel heard about it, they jumped to the conclusion that these people, the tribes that were leaving Israel, going to the other side, were defecting, were turning to false worship, which was nothing of the case. But nonetheless, it highlighted the rest of Israel's zeal for God and for faithfulness to Him. Look at what they challenge them with when they confront them in verse 16. Thus says the whole congregation of the Lord, what is this breach of faith that you have committed against the God of Israel in turning away this day from following the Lord by building yourselves an altar this day in rebellion against the Lord? They were concerned that these 2.5 tribes were already turning from God, committing adultery, committing idolatry of some kind. And so they even go on to mention 2 incidents in the past, one previously recorded in Numbers before entering the land, that happened at Peor when God judged them with a plague because of their idolatry and immorality. And then again mentioned the account of Achan, when the whole of Israel suffered for the sin of one man. And so it's indicating that the people of Israel had learned their lesson. God doesn't tolerate sin. He demands and deserves and delights rather in our obedience. And so they thought that these tribes had wrongly built an altar, another altar of worship, an altar to another god or something, but in some way sinning against God. And in many ways, their zeal here can seem overreaching, because as soon as they heard that this is what these tribes have done, what was their response? What were they prepared to do? They assembled the people of Israel together to make war against them. That they were so zealous, so determined to wipe out any hint of idolatry or false worship, that these fellow brothers who had left their families, had come across and sacrificed years of fighting with them to conquer their land, who had been faithful up until then, were now returning rightfully home to go back to their own land and to be with their families, that these other tribes were in an instant ready to make war on them. Yet a month earlier, they'd been fighting together in the trenches. It seems an overreaction. But no, it's not. It highlights their zeal for the purity of worship among the people. In fact, so much so that the tribes say to the people, well, if you want, you can even join us in Canaan. If that will help you keep your worship pure, if that is what is needed, we are even willing to give up and share some of our land on this side, some of our inheritance for the sake of preserving your worship. As we read in verse 19, but now if the land of your possession is unclean, pass over into the Lord's land where the Lord's tabernacle stands, and take for yourselves a possession among us. These people were earnest to uphold obedience and faithfulness to God at all costs. And so again, we see from their zeal for the Lord the challenge to us of whether we are serving God with an undivided heart. Are we seeking, like them, to deal with sin swiftly as they sought to go to war even with their brothers to deal with sin? Are we prepared to do that with sin in our lives? Are we prepared to take the sword to the idols in our hearts and chop off their heads? Are we prepared to, as they were prepared, to confront sin in the lives of others, albeit rightly, that is, gently and humbly? But are we concerned about the purity not just of our own lives before God, but of our fellow brothers and sisters? Well, in the end, the only way that we can ever have this right zeal for God in our hearts is if our hearts are truly set on the glory of God. In other words, that we don't live life comparing our lives to others, but we compare our lives and those of others to the Lord and to His holiness and to His glory, that realizing that that's the standard. That's the standard that God expects for our lives, is His glory, His purity. Not just being better than the world. But more than this, we become truly concerned about God and His glory. We need to have a passion for His glory above all. We need to feel the weight of God's worth and majesty and magnificence, so that we truly hunger and thirst after righteousness. Indeed, we need to live with the fear of God. It's amazing how these tribes who were accused by the rest of Israel for rebellion and for turning from the Lord responded to them as they revealed the real reason why they built the altar. Saying firstly that if in any way it is true that we have turned from the Lord and are worshipping falsely, if in any way we have been in rebellion and breached faith, then do not spare us today. May God bring His judgment on us. You can take us out if we have in any way done such a thing. In fact, notice that their concern wasn't just being guilty of idolatry. They weren't just concerned about in any way seeming to have built an altar to another god. They make it clear more so that the reason for building that altar was not to provide a substitute for the altar at Shiloh at the tabernacle. In other words, not only was it not an altar to another god, in that sense idolatry, it wasn't even a substitute altar for the altar at Shiloh for them to have a place of worship closer to home, to offer their sacrifices and offerings. It wasn't even that. In other words, their concern was not just for not breaking the first commandment, which they were very aware of, not having any other gods before them. Their concern, in fact, was in not making an altar for sacrifice and offerings as well. In other words, to not make another place of worship than the one prescribed by God, which was set up in Shiloh, as I said. And so that's what they reiterate. Far be it from us in verse 29 that we should rebel against the Lord and turn away this day from following the Lord by building an altar, another altar for burnt offering and grain offering and sacrifice, other than the altar of the Lord that stands before him at his tabernacle. And so their concern was also not just for wrong worship, but also for false worship. In other words, they were aware of not seeking to worship the right God, but in the wrong way. They were in no way wanting to break the second commandment, even of making some other place of worship or some other graven image of God. In other words, they were not trying to worship God, but on their own terms. You remember that's exactly what happened to the previous generation of Israelites when they made that golden calf to worship while Moses was up on the mountain receiving the law from God. You know, they thought they could worship God according to how they thought he was like. And so their worship wasn't idolatry. They weren't breaking the first commandment then. They were in fact breaking the second commandment by making a graven image of God, melting down gold and making it into a calf to worship. And so in effect, they were worshiping the right God but in the wrong way. And these tribes understood that. They were so jealous for his glory that they were so careful to in no way be guilty of not only not worshiping the wrong God, but also to not worship the right God in the wrong way. But how many of us and how many today want God but on their own terms? They come to God but with their own terms and conditions, their own fine print in the contract. You know, I'll worship God but. I'll worship God if. We see this in churches today, perhaps, when the focus is on giving the people an experience rather than in giving them the word. We see this in churches today, perhaps, when song sung and ministry is done more based on man's preference than on biblical principle. We see this in the lives of Christians today when they will worship God by attending church when convenient, when nothing else, whether family or sports or beach is happening, better, instead of coming to church as a priority and a commitment. We see this in our own lives when we are happy with God when life is good, but unhappy with God when life is difficult. We see this in our own lives when we follow God in some areas, but justify sin in others. You see, we are all guilty in one way or other of worshiping the right God, but in the wrong way. Worshiping God on our terms. So the challenge is we need to seek to follow Him wholeheartedly, worship Him rightly, obey Him fully. The question is, are we jealous? Do we have the same resolve and resolute conviction and passion and desire for our worship of God to be pure and holy? Are we rightly consumed by the glory of God and concerned about it not just in our own lives, but in the lives of those around us and in the lives of those that will come after us, our children and the next generation? For that was too the concern of the tribes here. That was the whole reason that they built this altar, was as a witness to the fact that them staying on the east of the Jordan were as much part of the people of Israel staying on the west of the Jordan. That this was to be like a bridge, a connecting point, a uniting point, a witness that they both, on either side of the Jordan, served the same God and belonged to Him. And so it was as a witness, not so much even for those current generation of Israelites, but for the next generation, for their children who wouldn't have experienced what they had in taking the land and in fighting together and locking arms together in conquering the Canaanites, and who knew they were one, and who knew the situation while those people settled on the east and the rest in the west. That there was every chance that the next generation, that their children would forget this, and that those children of the people of Israel within Canaan proper on the west of the Jordan would say to those outside Canaan on the east of the Jordan, what part do you have with us? You don't belong. You're on the wrong side of the fence, on the wrong side of the river. You have no part here, and ultimately preventing them from coming to be able to worship. That's what their concern was. And so your children might make our children cease to worship the Lord. And so their concern wasn't just for themselves, their concern was for those who would come after them. That they would be unhindered and being able to come across and still worship God wherever the tabernacle was, then at Shiloh. And so it's clear that too, our passion for the glory of God should flow over into being deliberate and intentional about passing on the faith and passion for the glory of God to the next generation. It was great to see some of the Sunday school Good News kids up here. That's certainly an example of where it needs to be happening. But the question is, do we? Sure, there's a tragic story in the Bible, in the time of the kings. King Hezekiah had been a good king. He had reformed the spiritual life of the people. He had cleansed the temple. He had restored proper worship. But then, toward the end of his life, pride and complacency got the better of him. And so, because of certain sin and certain things that the people of Israel were guilty of, Isaiah then warned him, King Hezekiah, of the impending Babylonian captivity that would come as part of God's judgment upon his people. And the king's reply was this: "The word of the Lord that you have spoken is good." For he thought, at least there will be peace and security in my lifetime. How self-centered and how short-sighted. And so what part of their children's lives, of our children's lives, are Christian parents today most investing in? What part are we most investing in? Begs that question. Their sports achievements, their academic success, the university options, the opportunities to move overseas for a better life. What are we most investing in? Are Christian parents today actually investing in family discipleship, church commitment, and gospel ministry? Which kingdom are we teaching our children to live for? We need to be concerned about the glory of God and the purity of worship in our lives, in the lives of those around us, and also in the lives of those who come after us. Purity of worship. Secondly, unity of fellowship. Notice that the reason for the altar, as I've alluded to already, was to be a witness, a sign and a testimony of solidarity between the two sets of tribes, a beacon of the unity that they need to seek to maintain. It was an expression of a desire to be a people that remain one and view one another accordingly. That these eastern tribes who would live outside the main promised land boundary would not be disregarded, would be seen as one and as part of the rest of the people. And so they were rightly concerned that in time they could be forgotten, or worse, despised and cut off, and deprived of the blessing of being among God's people and worshiping God at the appropriate place. And so they wisely anticipated, these tribes, the potential threat to the unity of the nation, in that future generations who didn't experience all of what they had could proudly overlook these tribes. In other words, they wisely understood the human heart and the potential and the threat to disunity because of sin, because of pride. And so they deliberately put measures in place to preserve the unity amongst God's people. It's the same today, how we need to be aware of Satan's device and human sin that is ever a threat to the unity of God's people. And we've seen that throughout the history of God's people. We saw how it ended up that the nation of Israel did not remain united, that they would become a divided kingdom, separate into two, north and south in the promised land. We saw it in the early church in Acts, where there was the potential threat of jealousy and favoritism and neglect between the Hebrew widows and the Greek widows that threatened to divide the church and threatened the unity. We saw it later in Acts 15 when they had to have a special council to preserve the gospel of grace and also to preserve the unity of church over the whole matter of circumcision that was creating a division between Jew and Gentile. We see it in the book of Acts when Ananias and Sapphira acted in hypocrisy, threatened to divide the church and wipe them out because of it. We read of it, this threat to unity in the New Testament letters, how it was often attacked and compromised. And so in 1 Corinthians we read, I appeal to you, brothers, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be united in the same mind and in the same judgment. Paul, writing to the Ephesians, says, I therefore, a prisoner of the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, to live with all humility and all gentleness and patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. And so that is why we ought to gather regularly to show solidarity. That is why we must participate in communion together. That's our witness. That's our reminder of what binds us. The cross and Jesus and the gospel. And that's why we must practice church discipline when necessary, in order to deal with unrepentant sin and the division that left it inevitably will bring. And that is why we must get to know one another so that we can trust one another and not unduly judge one another and jump to wrong conclusions about one another. That's why we ought to listen to one another. That's why we must work hard at loving one another, which can't happen if you aren't around one another and involved in each other's lives and aren't sharing life together. That is why we must keep practicing theological triage and keep first order and second order and third order issues in their right place, so that we don't allow doctrine to wrongly divide us. And that is why, when appropriate, we must obey and submit to our church leaders as the Bible instructs. You see, there are so many measures that God has put in place to preserve the unity of His people and the unity of the church. This very unity that Jesus Himself was so jealous for and prayed earnestly for. You recall in His high priestly prayer in John 17, He says to the Father, I do not ask for these only, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, that they may all be one, just as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they also may be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. The glory that you have given me I have given to them, that they may be one even as we are one. I in them and you in me, that they may become perfectly one, so that the world may know that you sent me and loved them even as you love me. Jesus is jealous for our unity, for He knows that even our unity is a display of God's glory. And so in preserving unity like these tribes, we must be courageous enough to stand for the truth and courageous enough to act in love. And so this final challenge that these tribes faced is equally a challenge for us in these two important lessons: to be guarding the purity of our worship and to be guarding the unity of our fellowship. In fact, in a way, the two are linked, that it is a purity of worship that will inevitably produce a unity of fellowship. Our proper worship of the one true God is what unites us as one new people. It is our same God, our one Lord, this common focus of worship that keeps us together and makes us united. Just as Paul writes, there is one body and one Spirit. Just as you were called to the one hope that belongs to your call. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. Let us pray. So, Lord, we do ask that you would help us then to realize the great importance that you place on our proper worship of you. That we would worship you in spirit and in truth, for such is the worship as the Father desires. And Lord, that we would live for you among your people in unity of fellowship. For such is what Jesus prayed so fervently for his bride, for his body, for us. So Lord, we pray that your Spirit would work in us what only he can do in setting our hearts upon you, setting our affections upon you. That we would cling to you, O God, and that we would serve you with all our heart and with all our soul. In Jesus' name, amen.